The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Rosewood Palace as Princess Isabella made her way through the East Wing corridor. Her silk dress rustled softly against the polished stone, but her mind was far from the elegance surrounding her. The events of the past week had shaken the very foundations of the Kingdom of Valoria, and today would bring answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. Isabella had always known that marrying into the royal family would bring challenges, but nothing had prepared her for the web of jealousy and manipulation that seemed to follow her every move. As the daughter of a successful businessman rather than nobility, she had faced whispers and sideways glances since the day Prince Alexander announced their engagement 3 years ago. Most of the criticism she could handle with grace and dignity, but lately, something had changed. The attacks had become more personal, more vicious, and they all seemed to trace back to one source: Queen Mother Vivienne, Alexander's stepmother, who had married the late King Edmund when Alexander was just 12 years old. Vivienne had never accepted Isabella's place in the family, viewing her as an outsider who had stolen her stepson's heart and threatened her own position of influence within the royal household. What started as subtle undermining had escalated into something far more dangerous. Last month, Isabella had discovered that several negative stories about her in the tabloids could be traced back to palace sources close to Vivienne. The Queen Mother had been feeding reporters carefully crafted lies about Isabella's spending habits, her relationship with the staff, and even her dedication to royal duties. The breaking point came just 5 days ago during the annual Children's Charity Gala. Isabella had worked for months organizing the event, coordinating with dozens of organizations and personally reaching out to major donors. It was meant to be her triumph, a chance to show the kingdom how seriously she took her royal responsibilities. But as Isabella gave her opening speech to the gathered crowd of diplomats, celebrities, and philanthropists, she began to feel lightheaded. The words seemed to blur together on the page, and the room started spinning. She managed to excuse herself gracefully, claiming a sudden headache, but by the time she reached her private chambers, she could barely stand. Dr. Harrison, the royal physician, arrived within minutes. After a thorough examination and some discreet blood tests, his findings were shocking. Isabella had been poisoned, not fatally, but with a substance designed to cause exactly the symptoms she had experienced. Someone had deliberately sabotaged her most important public appearance. The investigation that followed was conducted in complete secrecy. Palace security, led by the trusted Captain Morrison, reviewed every piece of footage from the event. They tracked every person who had access to Isabella's private dining room that evening, every staff member who had prepared her food, and every guest who had come within arm's reach of her wine glass. The evidence pointed to a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the royal household. Security footage showed Isabella's personal maid, Sarah, acting nervously throughout the evening. When questioned, Sarah broke down in tears and confessed everything. She had been approached by someone claiming to represent Queen Mother Vivienne with an offer she couldn't refuse: $50,000 to slip a small amount of powder into Isabella's pre-dinner tea. Sarah insisted she had been told it was just something to make Isabella feel slightly unwell, nothing dangerous. She had been drowning in debt due to her mother's medical bills and saw no other way out. The mysterious contact had assured her that it would only cause a mild headache, just enough to make Isabella appear unreliable during an important public event. But the investigation revealed that the substance was far more serious than Sarah had been led to believe. Dr. Harrison's tests showed it was a sophisticated compound that could have caused permanent neurological damage if administered in a slightly higher dose. Someone had used Sarah's desperation to nearly kill the future queen. Prince Alexander was devastated when Captain Morrison briefed him on the findings. His wife had been deliberately poisoned, and all evidence pointed to his own stepmother as the mastermind. For 3 days, he struggled with what to do next. Confronting Vivienne directly could tear the royal family apart and create a scandal that would rock the kingdom. But allowing her to remain in the palace after what she had done to Isabella was unthinkable. Isabella herself had grown weaker each day since the incident. While the immediate effects of the poisoning had passed, she seemed to have lost her spark. The confident, radiant woman who had captured Alexander's heart now spent most of her time in their private chambers, afraid to eat or drink anything that hadn't been prepared under the strictest supervision. She jumped at unexpected sounds and had stopped attending public events altogether. The transformation was heartbreaking for Alexander to witness. Isabella had always been the strongest person he knew, someone who faced every challenge with courage and grace. Now she seemed like a shadow of herself, constantly looking over her shoulder and questioning everyone around her. The poison had done more than harm her physically. It had shattered her sense of security and trust. Alexander knew he couldn't let this continue. His stepmother's jealousy and ambition had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. As he prepared for what might be the most difficult conversation of his life, he thought about the young woman he had fallen in love with at a charity auction 4 years ago. Isabella had been representing her father's company at the event, and when she stood up to bid on a painting by a local artist, Alexander had been struck not just by her beauty but by her passion as she explained to her table why supporting emerging artists was so important. She hadn't known he was watching, hadn't been performing for his benefit, and that authenticity had drawn him like a magnet. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of secret dates and carefully planned public appearances. Isabella had never sought out royal attention. In fact, she had been hesitant about the relationship precisely because of the scrutiny it would bring. But Alexander had been persistent, convinced that she was exactly what the monarchy needed. Someone with genuine compassion, real-world experience, and the strength to help modernize the institution. Now, as he walked toward the Queen Mother's private study, Alexander felt the weight of his decision. Protecting Isabella meant potentially destroying his relationship with the woman who had raised him after his mother's death. Vivienne had been manipulative and controlling, but she had also been there for him during some of his darkest moments as a teenager struggling with the loss of his parents and the pressure of his royal destiny. But Isabella was his wife, his partner, and the future of the monarchy. She deserved to feel safe in her own home, and she deserved justice for what had been done to her. As Alexander raised his hand to knock on Vivienne's door, he steeled himself for a confrontation that would change everything. The Queen Mother's study was exactly as Alexander remembered from his childhood. Dark wood paneling, heavy curtains blocking most of the natural light, and the overwhelming scent of her signature perfume. Vivienne sat behind her massive desk, reviewing what appeared to be correspondence with various charitable organizations. She looked up as he entered, and for just a moment, her carefully composed expression slipped. "Alexander, darling, what a pleasant surprise," she said, rising from her chair with practiced elegance. "I was just reviewing the applications for this year's royal patronages. Perhaps Isabella would be interested in supporting the new literacy program for underprivileged children?" The casual mention of his wife's name, delivered as if nothing had happened, made Alexander's blood boil. Here was Vivienne, acting as if she hadn't orchestrated a plan that could have killed Isabella, still playing the role of the devoted stepmother, looking out for the family's best interests. "We need to talk, Vivienne," Alexander said, his voice colder than she had ever heard it. "And I think you know exactly what this is about." The mask slipped further, and for just an instant, Alexander saw something calculating and dangerous in his stepmother's eyes. Then she composed herself again, tilting her head with an expression of confused concern. "Is everything all right, dear? You seem upset. Is it Isabella? I heard she's been feeling under the weather since the charity gala. Perhaps she's simply not cut out for the pressures of royal life." The subtle jab at his wife's strength was the final straw. Alexander had spent years making excuses for Vivienne's behavior, telling himself that her criticism of Isabella came from a place of protective concern for the monarchy's reputation. But there was no disguising the malice in her tone now. No way to pretend that her actions had been anything other than a calculated attack on an innocent woman. "Isabella was poisoned, Vivienne," Alexander said quietly, watching his stepmother's face for any reaction. "Someone slipped a dangerous substance into her tea, just before the most important event of her year. Someone who wanted to see her fail, to make her look weak and unreliable in front of the entire kingdom." Vivienne's expression didn't change, but Alexander noticed her hands tighten almost imperceptibly around the papers she was holding. The silence stretched between them for several long moments before she finally spoke. "That's a very serious accusation, Alexander. I hope you have substantial evidence before making such claims. The reputation of this family depends on our ability to handle crises with dignity and discretion, not wild conspiracy theories based on speculation. The dismissive tone, the immediate deflection to family reputation, the complete lack of concern for Isabella's well-being. It all confirmed what Alexander had already known but hoped wasn't true. His stepmother had orchestrated the attack on his wife, and she felt no remorse about it whatsoever. I have all the evidence I need, Alexander replied, pulling out his phone and showing her a series of photographs that Captain Morrison had provided. Security footage of Sarah acting nervously throughout the evening. Bank records showing a deposit of $50,000 into her account the day before the gala. Phone records of multiple calls between Sarah and a number registered to one of your personal assistants. As Alexander scrolled through the evidence, he watched Vivian's face carefully. Still no shock. No outrage at being wrongly accused. No demands to see the full investigation report. Just a calculating assessment of how damaging the evidence might be and what her next move should be. And most importantly, Alexander continued, Sarah's full confession. She's told us everything, Vivian. How she was approached with an offer she couldn't refuse. How she was assured that the substance would only cause a mild headache. How she was told this was necessary to protect the monarchy from someone who wasn't worthy of the crown. At this, Vivian finally set down her papers and looked directly at her stepson. The pretense of confusion had evaporated completely, replaced by the cold, ruthless expression of someone whose carefully laid plans had been exposed. Sarah is a desperate woman drowning in debt, Vivian said calmly. People in such circumstances often create elaborate stories to deflect blame from their own poor choices. Are you really going to destroy this family's reputation based on the word of a disgraced servant? The ease with which she dismissed Sarah's suffering, the way she reduced a woman's desperation to mere inconvenience, made Alexander realize just how little he had truly known his stepmother. This wasn't protective concern for the monarchy or misguided worry about Isabella's suitability. This was pure, calculating cruelty from someone who saw other people as pawns, to be moved around for her benefit. This isn't about Sarah, Alexander said firmly. This is about you orchestrating an attack on my wife that could have killed her. This is about you using an innocent woman's desperation to commit what amounts to attempted murder. And this is about the fact that even now, even with all the evidence laid out in front of you, you feel no remorse whatsoever. For the first time since he had entered the room, Vivian showed a crack in her composure. Her carefully modulated voice took on a sharp edge as she stood up from behind her desk, drawing herself to her full height. Remorse? She repeated, her voice rising slightly. For trying to protect this monarchy from a gold-digging opportunist who has no understanding of what it means to serve the crown? Isabella has been a disaster from the moment she set foot in this palace. She's too familiar with the staff, too casual in her approach to protocol, and completely unprepared for the scrutiny that comes with royal life. The venom in her voice was shocking, but Alexander realized that this was probably the first time Vivian had spoken honestly about her feelings toward Isabella. All those years of subtle undermining and carefully worded criticism had been building toward this moment. She makes you look weak, Alexander, Vivian continued, beginning to pace behind her desk. The tabloids mock her fashion choices, the aristocracy whispers about her common background, and the public sees her nervousness at formal events. She's dragging down the reputation you've spent your entire life building. Alexander felt a surge of protective anger unlike anything he had ever experienced. To hear someone dismiss Isabella's kindness as weakness, her relatability as common, her occasional nervousness as incompetence. It was like watching someone attack everything he loved about the woman he had chosen to spend his life with. Isabella's common background is exactly why the people love her. Alexander shot back. She understands their struggles because she's lived them. She connects with them in a way that no one in this family has been able to do for generations. And her nervousness? That's because she cares so much about doing right by the crown and the kingdom that she puts enormous pressure on herself to be perfect. But Vivienne wasn't listening. She had moved to the window and was staring out at the palace gardens, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. "Your father would be ashamed," she said quietly, the words hitting Alexander like a physical blow. "He spent his life upholding the dignity and traditions of this monarchy, and you're willing to throw it all away for a woman who will never truly understand what it means to be royal." The invocation of his father's memory was a low blow, and Vivienne knew it. King Edmund had been a complicated man, devoted to duty above all else, sometimes to the detriment of his relationships with his children. Alexander had spent years trying to live up to his father's example while also trying to modernize the monarchy for a new generation. "My father would be proud of me for choosing love over politics," Alexander said firmly. "And he would be horrified by what you've done to Isabella. Whatever your feelings about her background or her suitability, attempting to poison her was crossing a line that can never be uncrossed." Vivienne turned back to face him, and Alexander was struck by how different she looked. Gone was the elegant, composed queen mother he had known all his life. In her place stood a woman whose carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled, revealing the calculating, ruthless person underneath. "Fine," she said, her voice taking on a tone of cold resignation. "You want to know the truth?" "Yes. I arranged for Isabella to be given something that would make her ill during the charity gala. But it wasn't supposed to be dangerous. I was told it would simply cause fatigue and mild confusion, just enough to make her appear unreliable during an important public event." The casual admission of guilt was almost more shocking than the crime itself. There was no remorse in her voice, no recognition of the severity of what she had done. She spoke as if she had simply made an error in judgment, rather than orchestrated a potentially lethal attack on a member of her own family. "You nearly killed her, Vivienne," Alexander said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Dr. Harrison said that if the dose had been even slightly higher, Isabella could have suffered permanent brain damage, or worse. You played with someone's life like it was a game." Vivienne shrugged, a gesture so dismissive and callous that Alexander felt physically sick. "I trusted the wrong person to handle the details," she said simply. "But the principle remains sound. Isabella needed to be shown her place, and you needed to see her weaknesses exposed. If she can't handle a little adversity, how can she possibly handle the pressures of being queen?" The twisted logic was breathtaking in its cruelty. In Vivienne's mind, poisoning Isabella had been some kind of test, a way to prove her unsuitability for royal life. The fact that it could have killed her was merely an unfortunate miscalculation, not a reason for remorse or regret. Alexander realized in that moment that there could be no reconciliation, no path forward that included both Isabella and Vivienne under the same roof. His stepmother had revealed herself to be someone capable of attempted murder in service of her own ambitions, and there was no coming back from that. The conversation continued for another hour, but nothing Vivienne said could undo the damage of her confession. She alternated between trying to justify her actions and attempting to minimize their severity, but never once did she express genuine remorse for what she had done to Isabella. If anything, she seemed frustrated that her plan had been discovered, rather than sorry that it had been executed. As Alexander finally left his stepmother's study, he felt as if he were walking away from his childhood itself. The woman who had raised him, who had been there for him through some of the most difficult moments of his life, was gone. In her place was someone he didn't recognize. Someone whose love for him had apparently always been conditional on his willingness to prioritize her vision of the monarchy over his own happiness. The weight of what came next pressed down on his shoulders as he made his way back to the chambers he shared with Isabella. There would be consequences for Vivienne's actions, serious ones that would reshape the royal family permanently. But first, he needed to tell his wife that justice would finally be served, and that she would never again have to fear for her safety in her own home. Isabella was sitting by the window in their private sitting room when Alexander returned, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She looked up as he entered, and he could see in her eyes the mixture of hope and fear that had become so familiar over the past week. Hope that the investigation would finally provide answers and justice. fear that those answers might be too painful to bear. "It's over," Alexander said softly, crossing the room to kneel beside her chair. "I confronted Vivienne, and she confessed to everything. She arranged for you to be poisoned." "Isabella." She admitted it without any remorse whatsoever. Isabella's hands began to tremble, and the teacup rattled against its saucer. Alexander gently took it from her and set it aside before taking her hands in his. They were ice cold despite the warm afternoon sun streaming through the windows. "I knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Deep down, I think I always knew it was her. But hearing you say it, knowing for certain, it makes it real in a way I wasn't prepared for." Alexander could see the tears beginning to form in his wife's eyes, and his heart broke for what she had endured. The constant vigilance, the fear of eating or drinking anything that hadn't been carefully monitored, the way she had withdrawn from public life, just when she was beginning to find her footing as a royal. All of it had been the result of a calculated attack by someone who should have protected her. "She said she was protecting the monarchy," Alexander continued, his voice heavy with disgust. "She claimed that you were dragging down my reputation, that the public didn't respect you, that you were too common for royal life. She actually seemed to believe that poisoning you was some kind of noble act." Isabella pulled her hands free and stood up abruptly, moving to the window and staring out at the palace gardens. Her reflection in the glass looked fragile and haunted, a far cry from the confident woman who had walked down the aisle 3 years ago to become his wife. "Maybe she was right," Isabella said quietly, her voice so soft that Alexander had to strain to hear her. "Maybe I am too common for this life. Maybe I never should have believed that someone like me could become queen." The defeated tone in her voice was like a knife to Alexander's heart. This was exactly what Vivienne had wanted. To break Isabella's spirit. To make her doubt herself so thoroughly that she would simply disappear from royal life altogether. The poisoning had been just one part of a longer campaign designed to destroy his wife's confidence and sense of belonging. Alexander stood and moved to join Isabella at the window, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "Don't let her win," he said firmly. "Don't let her poison your mind the way she poisoned your body. You belong here, Isabella. The people love you. I love you. And you've brought more positive change to this monarchy in 3 years than it had seen in the previous 3 decades." Isabella leaned back against his chest, and Alexander could feel some of the tension leaving her body. They stood together in silence for several minutes, looking out at the gardens where Isabella had established a new children's play area for visiting families, and had started an organic vegetable garden to supply the palace kitchens with fresh produce. Both initiatives had been met with initial resistance from the palace staff, but had ultimately become sources of pride for the entire household. "What happens now?" Isabella asked finally. "We can't just pretend this didn't happen, but we can't exactly have Vivienne arrested without creating a massive scandal either. The monarchy has survived for centuries by handling its problems discreetly." It was a question that Alexander had been wrestling with since leaving his stepmother's study. Vivienne's actions had been criminal, but she was also the Queen Mother, a figure of significant public respect and admiration. Any legal action against her would inevitably become public knowledge, potentially damaging the monarchy's reputation and providing ammunition for Republican movements throughout the kingdom. "She has to leave," Alexander said, the words feeling strange and final as he spoke them. "I can't have her in the same palace as you. Not after what she's done. But I think we can find a way to handle this that protects both your safety and the monarchy's reputation." Over the next few hours, Alexander and Isabella worked together to develop a plan that would ensure justice while minimizing public scandal. It would require careful coordination with palace officials, discreet consultation with legal advisors, and perhaps most challenging of all, a final confrontation with Vivienne herself to present her with an ultimatum. The first call Alexander made was to Sir Robert Pemberton, the monarchy's most trusted legal advisor and a man who had served 3 generations of the royal family. Sir Robert had seen the monarchy through numerous crises, from financial scandals to personal scandals to political upheavals, and his discretion was absolute. "Your Highness," Sir Robert said when he arrived at the palace that evening, "I've been briefed on the basic facts by Captain Morrison. This is indeed a most serious matter, but not without precedent. There have been other situations throughout history where members of the royal family have needed to be removed from court life for various reasons." Sir Robert outlined several possible approaches, ranging from forced retirement due to health concerns, to voluntary exile in exchange for maintaining her title and receiving a generous pension. The key would be presenting Vivienne with an offer that was generous enough to secure her cooperation, but firm enough to ensure her permanent departure from court life. "She must understand that this is not a negotiation," Sir Robert emphasized. "Her actions constitute attempted murder, and while we may be willing to handle this matter privately, that cooperation depends entirely on her willingness to accept our terms without resistance." The second crucial conversation was with Dr. Harrison, who would need to provide a medical assessment that could support whatever public explanation they ultimately provided for Vivienne's departure. The royal physician was deeply troubled by what he had discovered about the poisoning and eager to ensure that such an attack could never happen again. "The compound that was administered to Her Highness was sophisticated," Dr. Harrison explained. "This wasn't something that could be obtained easily or administered accidentally. Whoever provided it to Sarah knew exactly what they were doing and understood the potential consequences. The fact that Queen Mother Vivienne claims she was unaware of the substance's true nature is either a lie or evidence of criminal negligence." Dr. Harrison agreed to provide whatever medical documentation might be needed to support the official explanation for Vivienne's departure. Whether that involved physical health concerns, mental health issues, or simply a doctor's recommendation for immediate retirement from public duties. The third piece of the puzzle was Captain Morrison's security assessment. The head of palace security had been conducting his own investigation parallel to the official inquiry, and his findings painted a disturbing picture of the extent to which Vivienne had been able to operate within the palace walls. "She's been cultivating relationships with certain staff members for years," Captain Morrison reported. "Not just Sarah, but several others who have been feeding her information about Princess Isabella's activities, schedule changes, private conversations, even her medical appointments. It's been a comprehensive surveillance operation disguised as friendly concern." The scope of Vivienne's spying network was shocking and explained how she had been able to orchestrate such a precisely timed attack. She had known exactly when Isabella would be alone in her chambers before the charity gala, exactly which staff member would have access to her tea service, and exactly when the effects of the poison would begin to manifest. "All of these staff members will need to be transferred or dismissed," Captain Morrison continued. "We can't have people in the palace whose loyalty has been compromised, regardless of whether they understood what they were really doing." As the evening wore on and the full extent of Vivienne's network became clear, Alexander felt a growing sense of betrayal that went far beyond the poisoning itself. His stepmother had spent years building a web of surveillance and manipulation within his own home, turning trusted staff members into unwitting spies and using their intelligence to undermine his wife at every turn. The final preparation involved Isabella herself, who would need to be ready for the inevitable media attention that would follow Vivienne's departure, regardless of how carefully they managed the public narrative. Isabella had always struggled with the intense scrutiny that came with royal life, and the stress of recent events had only made that more difficult. "I need to know that you're strong enough for what's coming," Alexander said gently as they prepared for bed. "The media will speculate about why Vivienne is leaving, and some of that speculation might be unpleasant. There will be stories about family feuds, about you driving her out, about the monarchy being in crisis." Isabella nodded, and Alexander could see that she was drawing on reserves of strength he hadn't seen since before the poisoning. "I've been thinking about that," she said, "and I've realized that I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of hiding in these chambers and letting her win. If we're going to do this, then I want to be part of it. I want to face her when you present the ultimatum." Alexander had hoped to shield Isabella from having to confront Vivienne directly, but he could see the determination in his wife's eyes. Perhaps facing her attacker was exactly what Isabella needed to reclaim her sense of power and control over her own life. The next morning, Alexander requested a meeting with Vivienne in the formal throne room, rather than her private study. The setting was deliberately chosen to emphasize the official nature of what was about to transpire, and to make clear that this was not a family discussion, but a matter of state. Vivienne arrived precisely on time, dressed in an elegant black suit that seemed calculated to project dignity and authority. She showed no signs of concern about the formal setting or the presence of Sir Robert Pemberton, who was seated at a small table with several folders of documentation spread before him. "Alexander, Sir Robert," she said with a polite nod to each man. "I trust this won't take long. I have a luncheon with the Ladies' Auxiliary of the Children's Hospital Foundation, and I would hate to keep them waiting." The casual tone and reference to her charitable obligations were clearly meant to remind everyone present of her status and public reputation. But Alexander had moved beyond being impressed by his stepmother's political skills. All he could see now was someone who had tried to murder his wife and felt no remorse about it. "Please sit down, Vivienne," Alexander said formally. "What we need to discuss will take as long as it takes." For the first time, Vivienne seemed to sense that this meeting was different from their previous conversation. Her eyes moved from Alexander to Sir Robert to the documents on the table, and Alexander saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face. "We've spent the past 24 hours consulting with legal advisors, security experts, and medical professionals about your actions regarding Princess Isabella," Alexander began, "and we've reached some conclusions about how this matter will be resolved." Sir Robert opened one of his folders and removed a thick document that he placed on the table in front of Vivienne. "These are the formal charges that could be brought against you in a criminal court," he said in his precise, measured voice. "Attempted murder, conspiracy to commit bodily harm, corruption of palace staff, and several related offenses. The evidence is substantial and would almost certainly result in a conviction." Vivienne's composure finally began to crack as she scanned the legal document. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages, and Alexander could see her calculating the devastating impact that criminal charges would have on her reputation and legacy. "However," Sir Robert continued, "His Highness has authorized me to present you with an alternative that would allow this matter to be resolved privately, protecting both your reputation and that of the monarchy." He placed a second document on the table, and Vivienne's eyes immediately moved to scan its contents. Alexander watched as she read through the terms of what was essentially an exile agreement, her face growing paler with each paragraph. "You're banishing me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "After everything I've done for this family, after raising you when your parents died, after dedicating my life to the crown, you're throwing me away like garbage." The self-pity in her tone was remarkable given what she had done. But Alexander had expected this reaction. Vivienne had always been skilled at making herself the victim in any situation, and she would undoubtedly try to paint her exile as evidence of ingratitude rather than justice. "You tried to kill my wife," Alexander said simply. "There are consequences for that action, and exile is far more generous than what you deserve." At that moment, the throne room doors opened, and Isabella entered. She had dressed carefully for this confrontation, choosing a deep blue dress that Alexander knew was one of her favorites, and styling her hair in an elegant updo that projected confidence and authority. The transformation from the frightened woman hiding in their chambers to the poised princess walking across the throne room was remarkable. Vivienne's eyes widened as Isabella approached, and for the first time since Alexander had known her, his stepmother seemed genuinely surprised. She had clearly expected Isabella to remain hidden away, while the men handled the serious business of her punishment. "Your Majesty," Isabella said formally, addressing Vivienne by her title but with a coldness that made the words sound like an insult. "I wanted to be here to see you accept responsibility for what you've done." The directness of Isabella's approach seemed to catch Vivienne off guard. She had built her attack on the assumption that Isabella was weak and easily intimidated, but the woman standing before her now projected strength and determination. "Isabella, dear," Vivienne said, trying to reclaim control of the narrative. "I hope you understand that everything I did was motivated by concern for the monarchy's reputation. Perhaps my methods were misguided, but my intentions were pure." Isabella laughed, a sound devoid of humor that echoed off the throne room's vaulted ceiling. Your intentions were to humiliate me and potentially kill me in the process. There's nothing pure about attempted murder, regardless of how you justify it to yourself. The word murder seemed to hit Vivienne like a physical blow. Throughout this entire crisis, she had consistently minimized her actions, referring to them as a mistake or poor judgment, rather than acknowledging the criminal nature of what she had done. I never intended for you to be seriously harmed, Vivienne protested, her voice rising with desperation. I was told the substance would only cause mild discomfort, just enough to make you appear unreliable during an important event. Isabella stepped closer to Vivienne, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more intimidating than shouting would have been. You hired someone to poison me without knowing what they were giving me or what the consequences might be. You gambled with my life to satisfy your own jealousy, and you lost. The confrontation continued for nearly an hour as Sir Robert walked Vivienne through the terms of her exile. She would retain her title, but would be required to leave the kingdom within 1 week, and would not be permitted to return without express written permission from the crown. Her pension would be generous, but contingent on her maintaining complete silence about the circumstances of her departure. You're destroying the monarchy, Vivienne said finally, signing the agreement with shaking hands. The Republican movement will use my departure as evidence that the royal family is falling apart. You're handing them exactly the ammunition they need to bring down the crown. Alexander had considered this possibility extensively, but Sir Robert had assured him that the public narrative could be managed effectively. Vivienne's departure would be explained as a voluntary retirement due to health concerns and a desire to spend more time with family abroad. The palace's media team had already begun crafting the official statement that would be released the following week. The monarchy will survive your departure, Alexander said firmly. In fact, it will be stronger without someone willing to commit attempted murder to advance their political agenda. As Vivienne gathered her dignity and prepared to leave the throne room for what would likely be the last time, she turned back to face Isabella with a final attempt at intimidation. You think you've won, she said, her voice cold and bitter. I may be leaving, but the whispers will continue, the criticism will persist, and eventually, the pressure will break you just as surely as any poison could. Isabella met her gaze steadily, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had survived an assassination attempt and emerged stronger. The only thing that could break me was living in fear of someone I thought I could trust. Now that you're gone, I have nothing left to be afraid of. Vivienne left the throne room without another word, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she walked toward a future she had never imagined. Within hours, she would be packing her belongings under the supervision of palace security, preparing for an exile that would likely last the rest of her life. For Alexander and Isabella, the confrontation marked the end of a nightmare that had threatened to destroy both their marriage and Isabella's sense of security. But as they stood together in the throne room, where generations of their predecessors had made decisions that shaped the kingdom's future, they knew that their own reign would be defined by this moment of choosing justice over family loyalty and protection over political convenience. The news of Queen Mother Vivienne's sudden retirement broke 3 days later, just as Sir Robert had promised. The palace's official statement cited health concerns and a desire to spend time with family abroad, making no mention of the investigation, the poisoning, or the dramatic confrontation in the throne room. To the outside world, it appeared to be a natural transition, as an aging royal stepped back from public duties. The media reaction was immediate but largely predictable. Some outlets speculated about hidden health issues, while others suggested that Vivienne had grown tired of the constant scrutiny that came with royal life. A few gossip magazines hinted at possible tensions within the royal family, but without any concrete evidence or palace sources willing to go on record, these stories quickly faded from the headlines. Isabella watched the coverage from the safety of their private chambers, marveling at how completely the truth could be hidden when necessary. The woman who had tried to murder her was being portrayed as a dignified royal, voluntarily stepping back from public service, and the public was largely accepting this narrative without question. Does it bother you? Alexander asked, as they watched the evening news together. seeing her painted as some kind of noble figure, while no one knows what she really did to you? Isabella considered the question carefully. A week ago, the thought of Vivienne escaping public consequence for her actions would have filled her with rage. But now, watching the coverage, she felt something closer to relief than anger. "I think justice comes in many forms," she said finally. "She may have avoided criminal charges and public humiliation, but she's lost everything that mattered to her. Her position, her influence, her home, her relationship with you, it's all gone. In some ways, that might be a worse punishment than prison." Alexander nodded, understanding what Isabella meant. Vivienne had spent decades building her power and influence within the royal household, carefully cultivating relationships and positioning herself as an indispensable advisor. Losing all of that overnight, being forced into exile with no hope of return, would be devastating for someone who had defined herself through her royal status. The first real test of their ability to move forward came just 4 days after Vivienne's departure, when Isabella was scheduled to attend the opening of a new children's hospital wing that she had helped fund through her charitable foundation. It would be her first public appearance since the poisoning, and Alexander could see his wife's nervousness as the date approached. "I keep expecting to feel afraid," Isabella confided the night before the event. "But instead, I just feel angry. Angry that she stole so much time from me. So many opportunities to connect with people and make a difference. I want that time back. And I want to prove that she didn't break me." The hospital visit was a triumph that exceeded everyone's expectations. Isabella moved through the crowd of doctors, nurses, patients, and families with a confidence and warmth that reminded Alexander why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. She spent extra time with each child, listening to their stories and asking thoughtful questions about their treatment. When a 7-year-old girl named Emma asked Isabella if she was scared of being a princess, Isabella knelt down to the child's eye level and gave an answer that would be quoted in newspapers across the kingdom. "Sometimes I am scared," Isabella said honestly. "But being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave. It means you do what's right, even when it's difficult, and you take care of the people you love, even when someone tries to stop you." The simple wisdom of her response, delivered without pretense or political calculation, reminded everyone watching why Isabella had become so beloved by the public. She had never pretended to be perfect or superhuman. Instead, she had always been refreshingly honest about her struggles and uncertainties. The media coverage of the hospital visit was overwhelmingly positive, with several commentators noting that Isabella seemed more confident and authoritative than ever before. One royal correspondent wrote that she appeared to have found her voice as a senior royal, and that her obvious passion for children's welfare made her a perfect representative for the modernizing monarchy. Alexander watched his wife's transformation with a mixture of pride and admiration. The woman who had hidden in their chambers just weeks ago, afraid to eat or drink anything that hadn't been carefully monitored, was now commanding rooms full of people with natural ease. It was as if removing the threat of Vivienne's sabotage had freed Isabella to become the royal she was always meant to be. The second major challenge came when Captain Morrison presented his final security report on the extent of Vivienne's surveillance network within the palace. The investigation had revealed that at least 12 staff members had been providing information to the Queen Mother over the past 3 years, most of them believing they were simply keeping her informed about palace operations rather than participating in a campaign of harassment. "The good news is that most of these staff members were unwitting participants," Captain Morrison explained during a private briefing. "They thought they were being helpful and had no idea their information was being used to orchestrate attacks on Princess Isabella. However, 3 individuals appear to have been aware that their actions were intended to cause harm. The 3 knowing participants included Sarah, who had already confessed to administering the poison, along with 2 senior staff members who had been deliberately spreading negative stories about Isabella to tabloid reporters. All 3 would need to be dismissed immediately, while the unwitting participants could be retained after being fully briefed on the situation." "What about the stories that have already been published?" Isabella asked. "Some of those articles were quite damaging, and they're still circulating online." Sir Robert had anticipated this concern and had already begun working with the palace's legal team to address the false stories. "We can request retractions and corrections from reputable outlets," he explained. "For less scrupulous publications, we may need to consider legal action. The important thing is establishing a clear record that these stories were based on fabricated information provided by dismissed palace staff." The process of rebuilding trust within the palace took several weeks. But Alexander was impressed by how quickly the remaining staff rallied around Isabella once they understood what had been happening. Many expressed horror at learning how their innocent comments had been twisted and used against the princess they had come to genuinely respect and care for. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, who had worked at the palace for over 30 years, requested a private meeting with Isabella to personally apologize for unknowingly contributing to the surveillance network. "I thought I was being friendly when Queen Mother Vivian asked about your daily routine," Mrs. Henderson said, tears streaming down her face. "I never imagined that telling her about your morning walks or your favorite tea would be used to hurt you. I feel like such a fool." Isabella's response demonstrated the grace and forgiveness that had always been her greatest strengths as a royal. Rather than accepting the apology with formal politeness, she embraced Mrs. Henderson and assured her that no blame rested with staff members who had been manipulated. "You were kind to someone you trusted," Isabella said gently. "That's not something to apologize for. The only person responsible for what happened is the person who chose to use your kindness as a weapon." Word of Isabella's compassionate response to the staff's distress spread quickly throughout the palace, cementing her reputation as someone who truly cared about the people who worked for her. The loyalty she had earned through 3 years of treating everyone with respect and dignity now proved invaluable as the household united behind her in the aftermath of Vivienne's exile. The third major milestone came 6 weeks after Vivienne's departure, when Alexander and Isabella received a formal request from the Prime Minister to undertake a state visit to the neighboring kingdom of Aldermere. The visit would be their first major diplomatic mission since the poisoning, and it would serve as a crucial test of Isabella's ability to represent the crown on the international stage. "I want to do this," Isabella told Alexander when they discussed the invitation. "I want to prove to myself, and to everyone watching, that I'm ready to take on more responsibility, not less. Vivienne wanted to make me appear weak and unreliable, but I'm stronger now than I was before this all started." The Aldermere visit was scheduled for 10 days and would include meetings with government officials, visits to cultural sites, and several formal dinners with international dignitaries. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes diplomatic event that had made Isabella nervous in the past. But her approach to preparation revealed how much she had changed. Rather than focusing anxiously on potential mistakes or protocol errors, Isabella threw herself into studying Aldermere's history, culture, and current political situation. She met with experts on trade relations, environmental policy, and cultural exchange programs, determined to use the visit to advance meaningful cooperation between the two kingdoms. "She's approaching this like a serious diplomat, rather than a ceremonial figurehead," Alexander observed to Sir Robert as they watched Isabella conduct a practice negotiation session with the foreign ministry staff. Vivienne always criticized her for being too casual about royal duties, but I think what she actually saw was someone who wanted to do more than just cut ribbons and pose for photographs. The state visit exceeded everyone's expectations and marked Isabella's emergence as a significant diplomatic asset for the kingdom. Her genuine interest in Aldermere's environmental conservation programs led to the signing of a new cooperation agreement that had been stalled in negotiations for over 2 years. Her natural rapport with the Aldermere royal family's children resulted in the establishment of a new student exchange program between the two kingdoms' universities. Most importantly, her confidence and poise throughout the formal events demonstrated that she had not been diminished by Vivienne's attacks, but had instead been strengthened by overcoming them. International media coverage consistently praised her warmth, intelligence, and diplomatic skill, with several commentators noting that she seemed to have grown significantly into her royal role. The final resolution of the Vivienne crisis came 3 months later, when Alexander received a letter from his stepmother's lawyers informing him that she had purchased a villa in the Mediterranean kingdom of Santa Rosa and would be establishing permanent residence there. The letter included a formal statement renouncing any claim to future involvement in the affairs of the Valorian royal family. "She's really gone," Isabella said when Alexander shared the news with her. They were sitting in their private garden, watching the sunset paint the palace walls in shades of gold and pink. "After all these months, I think I'm finally starting to believe that this is really over." Alexander reached for his wife's hand, marveling at how different she seemed from the frightened woman who had collapsed at the charity gala. The confidence she had gained, the strength she had discovered in herself, the leadership skills she had developed, all of it had emerged from the crucible of Vivien's betrayal. "I keep thinking about what she said that last day," Isabella continued thoughtfully. "About how the palace would never truly accept me, how the criticism and whispers would eventually break me. But she was wrong about something important." "What's that?" Alexander asked. Isabella smiled, and he could see in her expression the same determination that had carried her through the darkest days of the crisis. "She assumed that I needed everyone's acceptance to be successful, but what I actually needed was to stop being afraid of people who would never accept me anyway. Once I did that, when not calm, I found out that most people were on my side all along." The truth of her observation was evident in the transformation of Isabella's public image over the months following Vivien's departure. Free from the constant sabotage and manipulation, she had been able to develop her own authentic voice as a royal. Her approval ratings had climbed to historic heights, and her charitable initiatives had received unprecedented public support. More importantly for Alexander, his wife had rediscovered the joy and purpose that had initially drawn her to royal life. She no longer approached public events with anxiety but with enthusiasm for the opportunities they provided to make a difference in people's lives. The woman who had once worried about making protocol mistakes now confidently suggested improvements to outdated traditions. The final scene of their ordeal played out on a quiet Tuesday morning 6 months after Vivien's exile, when Isabella was reviewing applications for the next round of grants from her charitable foundation. Alexander found her in their private study, surrounded by proposals from organizations working on everything from literacy programs to environmental conservation to mental health support. "Any interesting applications?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her desk. Isabella looked up with the kind of genuine excitement that had become her trademark since regaining her confidence. "There's a program that wants to bring art therapy to children in hospitals, and another one that's teaching sustainable farming techniques to rural communities. Oh, and there's a fascinating proposal to create mobile libraries for areas that don't have access to traditional library services." As she described each program with passion and detailed understanding, Alexander realized that this was who Isabella had always been meant to become. Not just a ceremonial figure or a beautiful addition to royal events, but a genuine force for positive change in the kingdom. Vivien's attacks had delayed this transformation, but had ultimately failed to prevent it. "I've been thinking," Isabella said, setting down the application she had been reading. "I want to establish a new program to support young women who are facing harassment or intimidation, something that provides both legal assistance and emotional support, with a focus on helping them find their own strength rather than just protecting them from danger." The idea was clearly inspired by her own experience, but Alexander could see that she was thinking beyond personal revenge or justice. She wanted to use what she had learned to help others who might be facing similar challenges, turning her ordeal into an opportunity to make a meaningful difference in other people's lives. "That sounds like exactly the kind of initiative that would make a real impact," Alexander said, taking her hand and bringing it to his lips. "And I can't think of anyone better qualified to lead it than someone who has personally overcome that kind of attack." Isabella smiled and leaned over to kiss him, a gesture that conveyed not just love but gratitude for the partnership that had carried them through their darkest hours. They had emerged from Vivien's betrayal not just intact but stronger, both individually and as a couple, committed to serving their kingdom with integrity and purpose. As the afternoon sun streamed through the study windows, illuminating Isabella's plans for her new charitable program, Alexander reflected on how completely their lives had been transformed. The frightened woman hiding in their chambers had become a confident leader, and the monarchy itself had been renewed by choosing justice and protection over political convenience. Vivienne's final legacy would not be the destruction she had intended, but the strength and wisdom that Isabella had gained by surviving her attacks, in trying to break a woman she saw as unworthy of the crown. The Queen Mother had instead forged someone who would redefine what it meant to be royal in the modern era. And for Alexander, watching his wife plan new ways to help others while surrounded by evidence of her own triumph over adversity, there could be no more fitting conclusion to their ordeal than this: love and justice prevailing over jealousy and cruelty, and a stronger future emerging from the ashes of betrayal.